Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Juan Eduardo Wolf, Assistant Professor of Ethnomusicology at the UO School of Music and Dance. He's also a core faculty member of the Folklore program. Wolf began teaching at the U of O in fall 2013 after earning his PhD in folklore and ethnomusicology at Indiana University. Wolf's interests include Afro-Chilean and indigenous Andean music, dance, and festive performance, and indigenous Andean languages and their revitalization. Wolf coordinates the World Music Series at the School of Music and Dance. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You are an ethnomusicologist, so my first question is, how do you define ethnomusicology?
So I teach the Intro to Ethnomusicology class, and the classic opening chapter has 13 definitions of ethnomusicology, ways of defining ethnomusicology. The simplest way to kind of understand this is that we like to think about music, people making music particularly in relationship to their cultural background. And so we want to understand music in the way that musicians who make music do, to make the music do, and think about ways in which that music relates to other cultures, ways that it might be different, ways in which it might be the same. And we're definitely interested in the way that people talk about music and think about it in its entirety. And of course, music in itself is a problematic term, so we have to figure out what kind of ways we're defining it in a particular moment in time. Music is inevitably linked with dance, and so I'm happy that we're at the School of Music and Dance. And most of the time I sort of refer to music as music dance, and so that you understand that we're talking about a whole series of complexities that involve expressive culture, and we like to look at it that way.
You've earned degrees in chemical engineering and studio art, so describe your path from that to folklore and ethnomusicology. How did you get there?
Sure. So chemical engineering and art. My father's a chemical engineer. My mother's a painter. And as they say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So that's where I initially got my orientation in studying. And I went to a school that wasn't particularly fostering of music in the ways that I was interested in it. So I found that I was doing music that was related to my background. My parents are Chilean. I was born in Santiago. That didn't have a space there academically, and yet found a way to work it in sort of in the social networks, right? And so inevitably, by the time I was done, I was leading a salsa band and performing in sort of musics that were related to Latin American musics, emceeing the International Students Cultural Show, those kinds of things. And so it was sort of seeded at that point anyway. It just took me a longer time to get there, which is why I often recommend students to make sure not to go to graduate school until you're absolutely burning with that desire. But at the same time, and suggest a gap year, right? But at the same time, I'm not the only one. So I know that one of the members of my graduate committee, for example, had his bachelor in astrophysics, and I know other ethnomusicologists who have undergraduate degrees in biology. So it's not uncommon to find a rather tortuous path to the field, and why we're most happy when we get there.
Your research focuses on the Arica region?
Arica, yeah.
Arica of northern Chile. What's unique about that area? What drew you to that area?
Well, I was surprised because typically, you hear about Afro-Chilean, or you hear about Afro-Cubans, you hear about Afro-Brazilians. But growing up and listening to the Chilean music that I had listened to, that my parents had put on record, and what most people are familiar with, say, in the Nueva Canción styles, the new song movement styles, when people talked about Afro-descendant music, you heard about Cuba, you heard about Brazil. I remember being in Santiago at one point and thinking about something was odd in the park that I was in, and it turned out that someone who was black walked by, and I realized that I hadn't seen someone who was black and that we would identify as black as maybe 2 or 3 months that I had been there. When I told my parents about it, they said, oh, it must have been a Cuban, must have been a Brazilian who was visiting. And so the idea here that was clear was that in Chile, the perception of there having been or being, let alone being, Afro-descendants in Chile was something that has been wiped out of the social consciousness for the majority of the 20th century. And so the idea is that when I first saw that there was a social movement that was expressing itself as Afro-descendant, my mother had sent me a videotape of a program, a travel program that showed some dances. I said, I'd never heard of this before. And so I was intrigued and decided to go to that particular region. And turned out to be that's what I ended up dedicating my PhD thesis to. It's Arica. It's on the border with Peru and Bolivia, very far away from the Santiago that my family background was. My grandparents lived. So it was a completely different experience for me and a very rich one. And so as a result, I ended up dedicating my research to that particular region and finding out that, quite frankly, yes, there's this history of Afro-descendant culture that exists in Chile. It's just that we haven't thought about it in very certain ways, and it was by producing music and dance in a certain way that we're used to seeing in terms of Afro-descendant culture in the Americas that it came to light and sort of got recognized. And what I was interested in finding out is, well, why hadn't we found that out before? And what are possible ways of thinking about it differently that might be useful to us to think about sort of the Black experience in the Americas in different ways.
Are there distinctive characteristics of the music and dance that's produced in the region that are identifiably of African descent?
Well, and I think that's where the question needs to be asked, is where are we thinking, or how are we thinking about these musics? That's sort of the instinctual question that has been led through the scholarship about Black music in the Americas, right? What Afro-descendant music should look like in a particular way. And so I could say yes. Starting in 2003, there was music produced called the Tumba Carnaval or Tumbe Carnaval, depending on who you talk to, that was produced on barrel-like drums. It was skin, played with one hand and one stick. It had a large drum that kept the rhythm, a higher drum that sort of improvised, and used sort of melodies that might be invoked that had similar relationships to other kinds of styles in the Americas. And so it was the production of that music, the Tumba Carnaval, that sort of led people to say, wow, there are Afro-Chileans there. But there are other ways to think about Black music. There are other ways to think about African music in the Americas that talk about different kinds of histories that we need to kind of take into consideration. And so there are religious dance troupes. These religious dance troupes dance to a beat that is fairly regular, straightforward, sort of marches. They dress in tie and impeccably white shirts and pants, right? And they dance to the Virgin of the Rosary in this particular area, and people wouldn't have necessarily considered that a Black expression, even though the term morenos is used, which could refer to Black people in a respectable way, or it could refer to them in a way that is related to the Moors, right? So moreno having that same root. It's not music people would necessarily talk about as being descended from Africans, right? But this is music that Afro-descendants participate in. And so what do we mean when we talk about Black music? Are we talking about the music that Afro-descendants participate in as part of their experience and that they made choices to participate in because of particular social situations that they encounter? Might that not be a more productive avenue to consider the ways in which Afro-descendants made choices to participate in sort of certain expressions? And so that's kind of where I put my focus on my work.
Do you want to describe for us some of the distinctive characteristics of the music and dance from the region in its own terms?
Well, the thing that struck me most, perhaps is the best way to say, is that it's a variety of musics that exist, right? And most characteristically, Chile is willing to has recognized constitutionally 9 different groups of indigenous peoples there, right? So people who are in First Nations, peoples who live in this area, we can recognize, not in Arica proper, on the entire of the country. Most importantly in this region are the Aymara people. So I also looked at, well, what does Aymara music look like in this particular region? And so that's more, people are much more comfortable in sort of identifying certain ways in which indigenous musics are present. So we can look at panpipes and we'll say, oh yes, of course, panpipes are Aymara music, right? And then we can look at carnival, particularly in that region of the country. Andean, if you think about carnival in the Andes, is very much associated with sort of certain Andean traditions associated with indigenous traditions, sort of producing a powwow and laying the blanket forward. But what do you do when you encounter a fact that a family has participated and plays in a panpipe troupe, who's Afro-descendant in nature, and would be more identifiable as Afro-descendant? And so now we're starting to talk about the fact that African people of African descent and indigenous peoples have lived in the Americas together now for over 400 years, right? And we're thinking about, or 500 years, we're thinking about, well, okay, so how do these barriers start to break down, and who influences who, and where does indigenous music start and African music stop? If both of them are doing dances where they knock each other over, which has been a kind of a characteristic that scholars have tended to point to as, oh yes, this is certainly of African descent, because of talking about bumping of the bellies that is often mentioned in sort of historical documents. People point to those kinds of things. Well, if indigenous people do the same kind of activity, where does this come from? And so many of the activities I found that Afro-descendants participate in this region might more obviously have been characterized, or have been more obviously characterized as maybe having indigenous roots, and not taking into account the fact that Afro-descendants were present and participating in these same expressions. And so I think that one of the reasons why, more generally in Chile, and we're looking at specifically Arica, but I think Arica is a microcosm of what happened not only in larger Chile, but perhaps in other parts of the Southern Cone, and in the Americas more generally, that certain types of expressions that could have been thought of as Afro-descendant expressions are glossed as indigenous expressions, and so you erase the presence of black people in that particular region. So that's what I think sort of points to these kinds of, so what characteristics, it sort of starts to become this very messy kind of thing. Well, yeah, I can point to this, I can point to that, and we can go that way, but I'm trying to figure out a way that would be a more profitable way of looking at it that might not have to deal with those questions in those terms, which is tough if you're a person who cares about what the expression looks like, right? If you care about music and dance and you think about it being important, then looking at the expressions by and of themselves should hold some value, and yet you kind of catch yourself in this paradox of trying not to associate those directly with a particular ethnic group. So, yeah.
Fascinating.
It's a tough question.
Tell us about the status of that population, that Afro-Chilean population. What's their social situation like? You alluded to it briefly before. Tell us a little more about that.
So in terms of recognition, the Afro-descendant population has been trying to be recognized in the census. So like other parts in Latin America, beginning of the 20th century, after emancipation, certain regions, so the idea was that we don't want to start to consider race very much, and it shouldn't be a factor, so we stopped taking information about them and about different populations. And so the problem becomes then, if you're trying to be recognized, there's no way of being counted. So one of the first moves that the different Afro-descendant political groups have done is to try and be recognized and counted in certain ways. And this has happened throughout the Americas in the 1990s, to beginning in the 1990s and onward. And so the idea is that Chile has been or Afro-descendants in this region have been trying to get recognized on census, but the Chilean government has refused to do so up until this point. And they campaigned very hard for the most recent census, but it did not come out. What they finally were able to get was that the government would do a study in the region, which was a little bit of a slap in the face because the Afro-descendant organizations themselves had done a study in the region previous to that, but they took things in stride, so at least so far that has, and so they have accepted and participated in this study that the government has put forward. So the hope is that the results of that study would then allow for a question to become available in the census. It's particularly important now that Michelle Bachelet has come back in office and has decided to change what might be and create a ministry just specifically for people, indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples, although it's not clear what that name is going to be yet, right? And whether that is going to be recognized in that particular way. But at least the conversation has started to, in a way that has been inclusive of Afro-descendant people. So the hope is that soon that would happen.
What's the source of the resistance on the part of the government? What is the downside from their perspective?
Well, I mean, once you start to recognize the rights of certain groups, then you start to engage in certain international treaties and obligations that people have with respect to those groups, and particularly First Nations and Afro-descendant groups have made strides in terms of international agreements lately that have allowed them protections in terms of what their culture is, and also rights in terms of land and recognition of course, discrimination and in different ways in which in which the groups have suffered over time. So Afro-descendants, the region Arica is particularly interesting because, of course, it used to belong to Peru, or was under sovereign Peruvian control during the Republican era, and Chile took possession of that region after the War of the Pacific in the late 19th century. After which there was a 50-year period of time in which a vote was supposed to be placed. Okay, let's see who you want. We'll rule for, so it says, we'll rule for 10 years, and then a vote will be taken. And there was some dispute, of course, you can imagine, as to whether the vote had to be taken directly after the 10 years were up, or whether or not that just meant sometime after the 10 years were done. It grew to a period of about 50 years before it was resolved. But during that time frame, Chileans were migrated into that region, right? There was the government tried to push a large number of Chileans from the south into this northern region to make sure to establish enough of a voting base that would say, yes, we want to remain under Chilean control. Because of the stories that have been told, the idea that there were no Afro-descendants in Chile, and because Chile had no blacks, then anyone who was black in the region, well, that must be a Peruvian. And so they were run off their land. They were, a few women were able to hide in the valleys, but the Afro-descendant population in the region was basically either pushed out or treated badly in certain ways. Their land was taken away, these kinds of things. And so to recognize groups in that particular way is to also recognize that there might have been a maltreatment, that there might have been things, and it opens the door to a lot of different ways of having to deal with it.
The way you described your approach to the music of this region, the care with which you describe that, suggests that you have a kind of sense of cultural justice in your ethnomusicological research. Is there a social justice component for you in the work that you do?
It's inevitably tied to the research that you do. You work with a group of people. You show up on their doorstep. They have no obligation to you to sort of to have you participate, open their doors to you, and yet quite often people do, and they do with a sort of not necessarily expectation, but a hope that in some way the work that you do will allow will be beneficial in some way or another. And you try to reciprocate in certain ways whenever possible. So I was just lucky enough here to have Pusiri Marca, a group from Arica, come and perform here as part of the World Music Series. Well, you know, I had to do the old sit on the doorstep and wait to kind of be accepted to allow me to participate in rehearsals. But and after a while, they took me in, and that started the long process. But you know, eventually they took me in, and they've given me nicknames, and they've become sort of part of the circle of people that they know. And so for me, bringing Pusiri Marca here to Arica was sort of a way of thanking them for having taken me in and allowing me to participate and learn about the cultures that they represent. Similarly, the hope is to kind of be able to produce scholarship and discussions. We're having the Center for Latino and Latin American Studies is producing a symposium in March, and we'll be discussing issues related to Afro-descendant and indigenous issues, cultural policy in that particular conference as well. And the hope is that kind of information, that kind of discussion that comes forward is beneficial in some way to the groups that we work with.
Tell us about the work you've done with indigenous languages and the preservation of indigenous languages. I know that you have learned a couple of them.
Well, I've worked on a couple of them. It's a lifetime of learning, I would say. So I was lucky enough when I arrived at Indiana to have the chance to take classes with Francisco Tandillo y Hansesoy, who is a member of the Inga group, which speaks the northernmost variety of Quechua in historical terms. You know, this is where the boundary lines the linguists will draw if you look at historical homelands for these. And so in the southern valley of Colombia, Inga is spoken alongside another Kamensá, which is another language that runs there. And so I tried to learn from him, worked hard on learning from him, and realized that we both realized that there was the materials that were available were could be improved in many ways. And so we started to work on creating languages and lectures with the intent not only to create a way for people from the United States and English speakers to be able to work on their language, but because of the fact that many of the children that were growing up in that community and many of the teachers in that community did not know how to speak the language as well, that we would produce a Spanish language version of that method as well. And so we did. We were lucky enough to complete that project and produce a book that now has been both produced in English and Spanish, used at Indiana University to teach Quechua there, the Inga variety of Quechua there, and has been also presented to the Inga population in the Valley of Sibundoy to hopefully be used by them in their, and then that's a whole other process of making sure people can get copies and making sure people can have access to those books. But the hope is that the work that we've done won't be lost and will help kind of spark a regeneration of that language, a reuse of the language among the younger generation, who may have a number of speakers but may not write the language or have an easy way of writing the language, and so Francisco had spent a lot of time in alphabetizing the language and working on that, and so that was one of the things that the book brings with it.
Can you tell us about some of the classes that you teach at UO? What are some of the topics of the courses that you teach?
Sure. Well, I teach the classic courses for ethnomusicologists, which are music and world cultures, which is Music 358. It's required for all music majors, as well as the Intro to Ethnomusicology taught for undergraduates and graduate students as well. Lucky to say that we had just been approved for a class that deals with regional musics and cultures, and so I'm hoping to teach a class on music in the Andes in that vein, and as well as music in Puerto Rico is actually being offered next term. It's where some of my research might be turning after this project gets finished. I was lucky enough to work with a group of Cuatro students in Chicago while I was studying Aymara. I worked with the Puerto Rican community in Chicago for a small portion of the time. It piqued my interest in that region. So I'll be working with that, and we're hoping to bring up, as part of this class panel, a Puerto Rican activist who plays bomba music during that time frame to present at that conference as well. So music in Puerto Rico, music in the Andes, and of course we'll be starting ensembles as well. So there'll be an Andean music ensemble offered in the spring and a Puerto Rican music ensemble offered next year.
You are a musician.
I claim as much.
Tell us what the instruments are that you play, the kinds of music that you play and have played.
Well, I think like many ethnomusicologists, well, I won't speak for all of them. I myself, and I've run into many people like this, jack of all trades, master of none is often the way I describe myself. So I don't consider myself a virtuoso on any instrument. But I managed to make do with many of plucked strings that come from Latin America. So guitars and charangos, the small Andean mandolin, right? The cuatro, both the Puerto Rican and the Venezuelan cuatro. I can kind of hold basic patterns and hold my own there, as well as I mentioned I was doing salsa band, so I was playing percussion and studied conga and bongo and those kinds of things in those rhythms, as well as the Andean kinds of rhythms that were available to you. So one of the ways that we learn about this music and talk to people and get more research done in the ways is actually playing this music and trying to figure out, well, when we get corrected, right? And panpipers, for example, are very vicious in their corrections. You just get smacked in the head if you play the wrong note. They will, you know, it is a window into why doesn't this sound right? Why can't my conception of what it's supposed to sound like match up right now? And once I figure that out, does that show me something? And a lot of times it does. It shows you sort of an aesthetic that they were looking for that wasn't part of your own. And so you need to, once you get that insight, you start to realize, oh, this isn't just here. This sound needs to be present to make the music sound anything like what they're expecting. And so those are the kinds of insights that we get from playing with, less so maybe performing, but playing with the people that we work with.
So these ensembles that you, the undergraduate or the student ensembles you're talking about, will you be teaching them the music?
Yes. So I will be teaching them how to play, but with, again, that idea of not so much of becoming a virtuoso at these kinds of instruments, but rather giving them an insight as to different ways of making music and thinking about, well, what are the values that might be that are here, that are involved in this particular music that I might not think of or might not have realized or present either in musics that I already play or in musics that you know are just completely different from the paradigms that I'm used to working with, right? So if my job is to make sure that everyone sounds good alongside of me, or I am very much focused on what the other person is sounding like next to me, that might not necessarily be the way that I've been taught to play by myself at the piano, for example. It's just as an example, you know, it's one of those things that. Community music making might be quite different from the ways of which professional music making might be working, and ritual music making might be quite different in the ways in which we might make music in a social setting. So those are the kinds of ideas that we're thinking about while we're playing, right?
So we have just under a minute left. So my last question.
Sure.
You've told us that you brought Pusiri Marca here. What other Are you bringing any other interesting groups as part of the World Music Series that you want to tell us about?
So the World Music Series hosts one concert per term, both in the fall, the winter, and the spring. As I mentioned, the winter concert hopefully will feature this Puerto Rican bomba musician with presenting his group, and the spring will be featuring a South Indian flute player. So for those people interested in those kinds of musics, be sure to contact us if you want to be able to get on the mailing list for that.
Thank you so much, Ed, for talking with us today. It's been a pleasure.
I've really appreciated this opportunity.
I've been speaking with Juan Eduardo Wolf, Assistant Professor of Ethnomusicology and Folklore at the University of Oregon. Join me next time when I speak with Brad Shelton, Interim Vice President for Research and Innovation at the University of Oregon. Thank you so much for watching.